Good afternoon. My name is Rich Butel. I'm a senior fellow at the Baroni Center for Government Contracts at the Costello School of Business of George Mason University. Welcome back to our second panel for our Baroni Center Roundtable this afternoon on the emerging roles and challenges confronting VARs and resellers. Our second panel takes a slightly different tack. We're going to turn from value-added integration to the broader reseller ecosystem, and to the role that is often less visible but no less consequential to the operation of the federal technology market. The word reseller can sound deceptively simple. It may suggest an intermediary that receives a quote from a manufacturer, adds a markup, and passes an order on to the government. That description may fit some transactions, and concerns about unnecessary pass-through charges deserve serious attention, but it does not capture the full range of functions performed by resellers in the federal marketplace. Federal resellers perform a host of essential duties. They maintain contract vehicles, translate commercial offerings into government-compliant transactions, coordinate multiple manufacturers, support invoicing and reporting, manage cybersecurity and supply chain documentation, and most importantly, assist smaller technology companies in reaching federal customers. Many of these functions are largely invisible, and when an agency looks only at the difference between the OEM price and the price paid by the agency, they're often missing much of what goes on. This is why the reseller debate cannot be reduced to the proposition that direct purchasing is always cheaper. An OEM may be able to quote a lower apparent product price, but the government must still determine who will assume the costs and risks associated with contract administration, compliance, financing, invoicing, customer support, and multi-vendor coordination. In many cases, manufacturers rely on resellers precisely because they do not wish to build and maintain the specialized infrastructure required to participate directly in the federal market. At the same time, agency scrutiny is real and justified. Government auditors have identified substantial price variations for identical products, while policymakers have raised concerns about hidden rebates, bundled pricing, duplicative support charges, and markups that may bear little relationship to the work performed. The policy challenge is to separate legitimate intermediation from unnecessary intermediation, to preserve the channel functions that reduce government transaction costs while identifying transactions in which the government is paying for little more than access to a contract vehicle. The market is also becoming more concentrated. Large resellers can offer extraordinary scale, financing, contract coverage, and access to hundreds or thousands of technology manufacturers. That scale can simplify procurement and enable smaller emerging OEMs to enter the federal marketplace. But it also can raise questions about competition, dependency, and market access for smaller resellers. The reseller of the future must therefore be asked to prove value in many concrete terms. How much burden did it remove from the federal agency? How quickly did it make a technology orderable? What risks did it assume? What savings did it negotiate? What small or innovative manufacturers has it enabled? Can those contributions be documented without creating a new compliance regime that costs more than it might save? Our second panel represents essential perspectives on these issues. Roger Waldron is our first panelist, and he's the president of the Coalition for Government Procurement. Roger brings more than 25 years of government contracting experience, including 20 years at GSA. His former positions include Senior Assistant General Counsel, Director of GSA's Acquisition Management Center, and Acting Deputy Chief Acquisition Officer. He also served on the Services Acquisition Reform Act Acquisition Advisory Panel. Welcome, Roger, to our panel. Our second panelist is Miriam Emdadi, and she is a Vice President at Carousel. Miriam has been a Carousel sales leader since 2006 and oversees channel teams supporting major technology manufacturers and emerging technology areas. Her portfolio includes Dell, Intel, RSA, Tenable, many 5G providers, and other OEMs, placing her at the center of relationships among manufacturers, resale partners, integrators, and public sector customers. Thank you for joining us, Miriam. Our third panelist is Elizabeth Sullivan. Lizzie is the president of the Madison Services Group. She focuses on federal procurement and small business policy and leads advocacy for small and mid-sized IT VARs through a group called GovEvolve. She has worked extensively on supply chain security, Section 889, CMMC, mid-sized company policy, and federal acquisition reform. She has testified before Congress in procurement innovation and the role of small and mid-sized contractors. Thank you, Lizzie, for participating this afternoon. Starting with Roger, I'm going to ask each of you to briefly state your perspective on the challenges confronting resellers and how agencies might consider addressing these challenges going forward. We'll conclude our session with questions and answers as time permits. Roger, the gavel is yours.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you to the Baroni Center for inviting me to participate in this panel, a very timely panel and discussion. I guess where I would start is sort of the big picture. I thought your summary was great. I think your paper is great in terms of laying out the functions and roles of VARs and resellers. And I really think, you could combine, resellers and VARs are really one and the same. There's a value being provided by resellers. It's just different flavors of it. And you do a very good job in your paper discussing that. At the end of the day, a couple observations. Number one, resellers, VARs, it's a commercial shared services business model. And what does that mean? VARs and resellers are doing a host of functions. You listed them in your introduction. They're on page 7 of your paper, that otherwise manufacturers, OEMs would be doing on a repetitive basis, have to have the infrastructure in place for each and every contract that they have. Yet, where a VAR or resellers bring multiple manufacturers to the market and in different ways, they're performing all those functions on behalf of each one of those companies. It's a shared services model. It's actually a very efficient approach to supporting the federal market and the commercial market as well. In fact, VARs, you can argue they make markets at the end of the day with the combinations of technologies and capabilities that they offer across a host of manufacturers. The concern I have, part number 2, is the concern I have with the approach or the focus on this is whether an unintended consequence of, everybody, we're all taxpayers, everybody wants to get a good deal for the taxpayer and for mission support. But are we unintendedly deconstructing a model in a manner that is ultimately going to increase costs or reduce competition or increase complexity in the contracting process? And I would note, and I would point out when GSA posted their blog where they talked about the results of the RFI that they put out, seeking information about VARs and resellers and who they are and what they do, which I commend GSA for doing that. One of their observation was about evaluation of price. And they talked about, for complex buys, encouraging line item pricing for complex requirements. So my question is, are we focusing on solutions and solution pricing, or are we going to do line item, in a certain sense, cost reimbursement type approaches? The revolutionary FAR overhaul and the administration's focus is on commercial solutions, commercial practices, and firm fixed price. And questions like that, or statements like that, just raise questions of how the government really sees it or not, or maybe there needs to be further conversation about the market, which is the service that this discussion we're having today hopefully will help move forward as well. And that goes to my last point. At the end of the day, and I fundamentally believe this. I've been doing this way too long, okay? But at the end of the day, sound requirements development and competition is how you drive value. And maybe it's appropriate to go to OEMs. Maybe that makes sense based on a requirement or what you're trying to accomplish on a mission. and from a mission perspective or overarching government perspective. But there's roles for VARs, there's roles for resellers. They can bring capability to the market that otherwise might not be available to the federal customer and to the mission. So in a certain sense, I go back to the opening of the last panel. When it comes to requirements in your acquisition strategy, it depends. And we should be, in a certain sense, agnostic, figure out what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that was a lot of the great conversation from the last panel. Figure out what you're trying to accomplish and then compete that, identify your requirements, have outcome-based approaches to it so you can measure that functional, value that Jessica mentioned and talked about in her discussion. Those are kind of my thoughts, opening thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Miriam?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Rich, and excited to talk on this topic. I 100% agree with Roger. I think the way we've been viewing this dynamic change in the landscape of federal procurement, and the way we see it, there's probably like a handful of big topics that I think are important for us to touch on this panel and continue to talk about in the dialogue of change. Roger hit on the first one, and so did Laura and Michelle, of like competition drives the best deal, right? The government always has had the choice to go direct. So the worry is when agencies cut the channel out and they remove competition from the reseller layer, is that a gain or is that a loss, right? So if the best deal on the table is a direct deal, you should take the direct deal approach, and why close it off to the resellers out there that might have a potentially better offer, better value, better price. So a little bit of dialogue needs to go around, like why are we kicking the resellers out of the bidding process? Does that get us what we want at the end of the day? So that's probably the number one driver of this conversation. And then, the channel agencies and channel resellers bring that agnostic view, which we talked about, which is a very unique capability. I think it was Tony who brought it up in his last story of when you work with these direct manufacturers, they're going to sell you what's in their back. They're incentivized to, as they should. But for a channel partner to come in as an agnostic, technical, consultative approach and say, hey, customer, you're trying to do this mission. This then vendor does what better at this part of the mission than this vendor. And let me put this solution together in a multi-vendor approach and make it cost effective. Let it make sure it delivers on the priorities that are important for you. That layer is imperative in the mission delivery of these programs. And the channel does it better than anyone. I would almost offer the channel is the only one that's able to provide that agnostic view. So another important topic that I think agencies need to think about when they start thinking about the inclusion of VARs into their business and working with direct manufacturers. My third big bullet was, hey, big companies out there, even the biggest ones we work with, need the channel in order to cover the government as a whole. The government represents maybe 10 to 15% of their business, and for them to build a team enough to cover all the agencies, all the risk, all the compliances, all the processes, it doesn't make sense for them to do it themselves. They rely on their partners to do it. And then all these small emerging tech companies also need the channel, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, which is, hey, I haven't done a single dollar in federal. I don't understand what the wide area workflow means. I don't understand what SAM ID is and the 100 things you need to learn to be able to even transact on day one within the agencies, and then have people represent you in the different agencies as a form of as an accelerator to their sales teams. So, but big companies have a big need, and it's different from little companies, but both of them rely on the channel as a way to scale, to have reach, to save money, and ultimately provide the best customer experience and lowest cost for the customer. And then, Rich, you included this in your white paper, but we talk about there's a little bit of a misrepresentation of what resellers are providing in the market today, which is the bad reputation of, hey, it's just a markup that we need to get rid of. Rich, you included the iceberg in your white paper, which is that, hey, you maybe government agencies see this just a markup in your deal, but what you're not seeing is underneath the iceberg, there is a ton of work and services and investment that these partners have spent years and years building to become specialized in delivering whatever it is they're delivering. And I could speak to that for hours. I won't, but I think it's important that we recognize that. And as we speak to how do we tailor and meet the government where they're at today, with all the changes happening, we need to make sure that that's a big gap they have not had to fill. OEMs haven't had to fill. The agencies haven't had to fill, and we need to make sure that that's recognized. And there's a little credit given there to the partners that have invested in FedRAMP and CMMC and all that, TAA compliancy and all that stuff and financial risk and all that. And then finally, the channel exists globally in every vector and every vertical, automotive, pharmaceutical, everything, and there's a reason for it. There's a reason why these big private companies invest and deliberately pick channel partners that they certify and they make strong in their technology. It's a commercial best practice. I think that means something. So they've figured out it's the fastest and least expensive way for them to be able to serve their customer best. So for hearing Laura and Michelle speak earlier and them emphasizing, hey, we're looking at VARs differently, but they're an important part of the process and we do need them. I absolutely agree with, and I do think, hey, there's a reason why a channel exists in every sector. They do a great job to become specialized, and especially in the federal government, especially in federal and public sector, there's so many requirements and risk there that outside of public sector doesn't exist. And the partners that serve this space really build their business around making sure that they can deliver what each agency needs, which is very customized, mission by mission, agency by agency. But yeah, overall, it is a dynamic, fast moving, and a lot of change happening currently in our government, which is a great thing. I think the great VARs out there are going to meet the agencies where they're at, inviting them to the table and hearing from industry and letting them showcase their value will be imperative in figuring out how we all do this together. And I do believe that, we are all better together when the channel is involved. Thanks, Rich.
That's great context. Thank you, Miriam. Lizzie?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Rich, and the Baroni Center. And Miriam, those were awesome themes. So I'm going to start with for my remarks, which is that you can't have it both ways. So in my view, you can't ask for competition while at the same time driving consolidation. You can't say you want cutting edge technology and the lowest price while also cutting out an entire segment of suppliers, in the thousands that compete every day to deliver those outcomes, aka the IT value-added reseller community. And it also doesn't work to say that you want fewer sole source awards when awarding multi-billion-dollar sole source and enterprise-wide agreements just to a select few. We've spent a lot of time talking to acquisition professionals over the years, as everyone else has much longer on this panel, about IT buying. And what we found is when they hear industry's perspective, they understand the value that VARs bring. And that's what VARs, I think, really are asking for. And you highlighted in your paper, Rich, which is the opportunity to present those facts, show value, and compete. Some of those decisions are being made, I'm sure, with the best of intentions recently, but I believe they're without a full understanding of how the federal IT acquisition works in practice for industry. So take, for example, the idea of cutting out the middleman. On face value, it makes sense, right? Remove a layer, it should save money. But at the federal level, it doesn't make sense at all, especially trying to get the best value for taxpayers. IT purchasing is often viewed just as a collection of separate products. I think I kind of heard that earlier. It's a laptop, it's a software, it's networking equipment. But that's not how technology buying works anymore. As Miriam also pointed out, it's not buy a box, sell a box. These aren't separate purchases, they're part of an integrated solution. So if you're joining this panel, you haven't thought about this before, think about the laptop you're sitting in front of, right? You're not just buying a laptop. You're buying the hardware, the operating system, security software, cloud connectivity, licensing, warranties, deployment. I could keep going, but everything has to work together. And someone has to make that all work together while also bringing in new products and innovation to keep pace with our current IT environment. And that is where I believe the IT channel adds significant value. Early in this administration, there was definitely a lot of discussion about the government buying more like Walmart, was an example the former GSA administrator used, using category management, aggregating purchases, buying in larger quantities, and driving prices down. And so for commodities, makes a lot of sense, right? And category management isn't anything new. But federal IT isn't a commodity. Every agency has a different mission. Every agency has different statutory authorities, different security requirements, different regulatory requirements. So they don't all have the ability to buy technology the same way, nor should they, right? And then if you layer on everything else, you've got things like, come to mind because I know Ms. Stanton was talking a lot about software, right? Software licensing and end user licensing agreements. Oftentimes, OEMs don't want to negotiate directly with the government, so VARs step in and assume that responsibility and risk. Then you've got the FAR, GSA cyber frameworks, supply chain requirements, small business goals, subcontracting plans. And the reality is, this really isn't a simple commercial purchase. The federal government isn't a simple commercial enterprise. It never has been, and it never will be. So while I absolutely support the goal, of course, also as a taxpayer, of making the government more efficient and getting better value, I believe that applying a commercial buying philosophy to such complex IT acquisitions just doesn't make sense. And I'll end with one last point because I think it's a good example of why flexibility matters in this marketplace right now. And Roger actually touched on this in a letter recently. We're seeing global memory shortages and continued pressure on the semiconductor supply. So think about your iPhone. Even companies like Apple announced recently they're increasing pricing for consumers because they're competing for the same components that everyone else is trying to buy. The federal government isn't immune from those market realities, so the idea that the government can always negotiate directly one fixed price or deal for a complex technology, regardless of what's happening in the global marketplace, just isn't realistic. So I think if we're serious about improving IT federal acquisition like we all want to, then we need to start with the reality of how federal IT is actually bought and not just how we like to imagine it's bought. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Rich. Thank you.
That's extremely helpful and is a great articulation of the landscape and the challenges going forward. I'm going to start with some Q&As now. And Roger, I want to begin with you. You heard what Laura Stanton had to say about the GSA RFI regarding what is a VAR and what is a reseller. And that really picked my attention, particularly in our academic studies, because there's no specific FAR definition of either VAR or reseller in the FAR or even across common commercial practice. I mean, there's a trade definition, I suppose, or at least a commercial understanding. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you here was because CGP, your group, gave one of the most fulsome letters back to GSA on that RFI. And Laura was kind enough to brief out the broad response. I'm interested to get more detail from you about what those concerns were that your group articulated back and whether what Laura briefed us out in terms of GSA's adoption of those industry comments was satisfactory to you or whether you think they were fulsome going forward.
I guess I'll start with GSA doing the RFI and looking at that information and then the follow-on conversation about how they're going to evaluate or look at VARs and resellers. I think it's important that, and I think they've demonstrated that they're taking their time, trying to figure it out and do it in a holistic sort of sound approach to addressing this issue because it's as we've just heard it's a much more complex world than probably lots of folks really understand it to be. And I include contracting officers at the General Services Administration, quite frankly, in that regard. Our concerns with regard to the RFI, what we wanted to raise and share were some of the things I said initially. I mean, looking at VARs and resellers as commercial shared business models and the services that they provide. And it seems to me Miriam and Elizabeth did a great job talking about the value that VARs provide to OEMs and the support they provide to OEMs. And it seems to me one of the things that the government in the RFI and just in my conversations hasn't recognized that value that's provided brings OEMs to the federal market. It's the channel through which, because it's being able to provide all those services that you listed at the beginning of the show again, and go back to page 7, that iceberg, all those things that they're doing to support OEMs and their ability to deliver product to the federal government. And then when you get into configuration and developing solutions as well, beyond that, it gets more and more sophisticated. And understanding that and how that supports broad cross-section of industry and their ability to provide support to the federal customer, and that's the commercial model. And we wanted to get that across. We also wanted to make sure that they understood that this concept of markups that everybody focuses on is like a misnomer, and that this is a channel relationship. There's agreements, there's discounts off product, there's all kinds of factors that go into how the pricing ultimately works and gets to the end customer. And that focusing on the idea of markups is a pass-through kind of concept, right? It's not understanding all the services and things that are done beyond that. And it's simplifying it to a point, oh, you're just doing a pass-through. You're marking it up. We could get it for a cheaper price direct. It's a relatively simplistic approach to the market. So we wanted to get that across. And then, we also, I mentioned at the beginning, go back to the theme, competition, sound requirements development, outcome-based. If you want to, ascertain value, what did you promise to do? What did you agree to do under the contract? Did you deliver that? How did it improve mission support, create efficiencies, deliver value? And I think the government is right to go towards an outcome-based approach to measure in a better way how that contract performance has actually made a difference in improving government operations, rather than it's just a low price, right? This is really it's a mechanism that should make best value even more important moving forward. And we're also very concerned, and this especially is concerned, is this approach of trying to deconstruct these services and assign a value to the various functions is a cost reimbursement model. And it's fundamentally inconsistent with the administration's approach. It's almost, Elizabeth, like you said, you can't have it both ways, right? It's like you want to go firm fixed price commercial, but you want to break down the functions and assign values to them in essentially a cost reimbursement manner that undermines your access to the commercial market. Why are people going to want to do that? Why is an OEM going to want to get into that complex, a process for, because then it doesn't stop there. Okay, so how did you get the value for the product? It's a slippery slope. Why didn't you get a better price? And you talked about price variability, which I know IGs and folks have talked about that a lot over the years. Competition would address that, and where I saw when I was at GSA and where we deal with and hear about from GSA is variation on the schedule pricing. And I think GSA has multiple different ways to address that. Number one, just ask the company, why is your price different? And they do that now. And then there's systems also and how they display pricing. They'll display the lowest price first. So the customer sees the lowest price, to the extent there's issues of, oh, you're going to go buy something at a higher price. So that's kind of a summary, high level summary, but it's a consensus statement that anybody can go find on our website that from our members on the issues and trying to provide GSA with greater context. I'll leave it there.
Very good. Thank you. Miriam, walk us through what happens behind the scenes between an emerging tech company deciding to enter the federal market and an agency ultimately placing an order. Which of these functions would disappear and which would simply shift elsewhere under a direct buying model?
A lot, probably 200 steps happen in between that, $0 in public sector to $1 in public sector. Just at the bare bones of it all, right? Understanding the wide area network, understanding how to get credit lines and how to get payments and how to get on GSA, how to get on the soup contract, how to access an OTA, how to respond to a CSO. But under each of those, by the way, there's another 100 things that they need to do. What is a CSP? What is a EULA? I don't even have a price list. How do I model my pricing model for the government agency? And then now there's two of us at this small emerging tech that need to sell to the entire government. Who should I sell to, and what are the priorities and missions and programs that will make sense for us to speak to? So it's so for them to try to do all of that themselves, build it in-house, figure out the back end infrastructure to support it, the inside sales to support it, the program management side, the contracts piece, the invoice and collecting, the getting capture piece of it, responding to RFIs out on the street. It would take years and tons of resources and tons of money. And it just, at an emerging tech company, it doesn't make sense for them to funnel that much of their investment into a $0 business when, obviously it's easier to sell into commercial. They don't have to go through all those steps. And that's not even mentioning like the compliance and all the T's and C's that are very specific to federal agencies that put a lot of risk on the OEMs and even the emerging tech companies to have to take on by themselves at the beginning of their business. So yeah, that's a big gap that channel partners fill today, not only guiding them through that process, but doing it on their behalf. And again, helping them become more of an extension of their company so they can have representation in different agencies and be able to, every agency wants things delivered a certain way and have a certain process. And them doing that on their own would, take them a long time to go to market within public sector, and that would be a miss for not just the companies, but for the government agencies as well.
And can
That's
I
great.
just say,
Yeah.
Rich, if I can, when Miriam talking about emerging tech companies, there's a common theme in Congress and also across federal agencies around new entrants. It's kind of been a hot topic for the last, I would say, couple of years. VARs bring in those companies, right? Because of all of the pieces that Miriam talked about. So then they're not going to do it solo. And if you eliminate or relegate this thousands of companies to now just be subcontractors, for example, to OEMs, the government's now going to find itself with a huge lack of emerging technologies and keeping pace in this environment.
I was going to ask to put a finer point on Miriam's comments and the impact of these things on smalls and mid-tier companies as contrasted to the large OEMs who can spread those costs across a large and existing financial foundation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if the direct model let's say in a world where that completely moved forward and that is how we now bought, you would find those companies gobbling up and buying the smalls to try and develop the infrastructure. And let me tell you something, they're not going to absorb those costs. They're going to pass them right back on to the government through an increased price, right? Why would a publicly traded company who has duty to shareholders then eat the cost just for the federal government customer, of which Miriam pointed out is 10% of the market share?
Right, right.
Yeah, Yeah, and well, you'd have consolidation, but you'd also have an explosion of contracts because if every OEM has to have their own contract, I mean, I think you'd overwhelm,
Good point.
contracting offices as well. And I would also add, Miriam, another thing that resellers and VARs are doing on behalf of OEMs is in GSA land, transactional data reporting, which is a new
Yep.
fundamental requirement. So they're going to be doing that as well, which requires you have to pay attention to it. It's a compliance requirement, and it requires the infrastructure to be able to to collect all that information, which actually you would think would be easy, but it's not that easy, even for the OEMs when they go direct, getting all the information and reporting it. So it's hey, you guys summed it up very well.
Well, Roger, I'm going to ask you to play devil's advocate. And now, based on your experience inside GSA and now representing GSA schedule holders, where does the government's critique of the reseller model have merit? And where does it misunderstand how the federal commercial marketplace operates?
Well, I don't know if I can be a devil's advocate. I just don't
Fair
know.
question.
So, but let me. I guess I will put it this way. It's not a bad thing to explore and understand how markets work and how this segment of the market works and supports both the OEM and the end user customer. That's not a bad thing. And because you understand that better, you can construct better contracts, better structures. You understand you can work better with the contractor if it's a VAR in a particular situation, learning those things. Do I Are there cases where it is purely a pass-through? Of course, it's like this is a big world. That happens. I'm not even sure that that's a bad thing if you aren't able to get the product that you need, but you need someone to be the intermediary between the end customer and the government. Um, there is this focus in a certain sense on price at the end of the day, which is understandable to the extent I can be a devil's advocate, but I think has unintended consequences by missing the point of value. And I don't mean what the value the VARs provide to OEM. I mean the value to the end customer through whoever the contractor is, whether it's a VAR, reseller, OEM. The focus on price misses that dynamic. And I think some of this is focusing so much on price. There's an unintended consequence there. Like we got to figure out what that value is and put a number on it. When you really should be looking more at the big picture is what solution did I need? Did I get that solution? Did it meet my requirements? And was it at a good price? Which, competition lends itself to that. So that's the best I can do with that question about being a devil's advocate.
And Rich, if I could add to that, I think this whole dialogue around the pass-through VARs that are just marking up for taking it, I do think there's some misrepresentation on what's happening behind there. And what I'm assuming was being seen as a pass-through VAR or just a markup VAR is someone who owns, is holding a soup contract and they put their markup to sell licenses or hardware. There's, again, a bunch of stuff that isn't being recognized in that markup, and that I'll bring it back to the iceberg. The capture process that goes into owning these contracts and to report on the contracts and be able to be compliant on the contracts is the cost that these resellers bear. And then behind the scenes, there are other things that are happening. An example I'll bring up is, hey, a reseller is reselling a license on the soup contract, and the OEM requires payment in net 15 days, and the government doesn't pay till day 142. And guess what? The reseller doesn't know that until day 120. So those things happen every day on orders where you can't predict what goes wrong, what gets returned, what goes back to inventory, things get shipped the wrong way. So when it goes back to, there's resellers out there just putting markup and not doing anything. I think that's far in between and doesn't happen on the regular, maybe in a one-off instance, because there are so many unpredictable things that happen in some of those easy deals that maybe there's not a ton of hands-on services on that still need to that are hard to predict and still need to, be covered, that the OEMs don't, give the channel coverage on, and the VARs really take the hit on. So that's kind of worth noting.
Go ahead, Liz. I'm
No,
sorry.
no, go ahead, Roger.
Just a second. So I think Miriam's point, we're trying to get away from, checklist type regulation and going to the lowest common denominator and like regulating to the worst case scenario. This is almost, some of this is, on anecdote that we have these pass-through folks who are, ripping us off when they're, when there's that iceberg and they're doing all these things. I mean, it's contradictory to philosophically the RFO and the way they want to go versus how they're handling this particular market, I believe.
That's a
Sorry.
really good point. Oh, no, talk about adding additional regulatory burden, right? Which is the opposite goal of what the administration, of course, wants to do. On that price point, I had a VAR call themselves the bank of the government, and I said, tell me more. And they were giving me an example of they were doing a huge order that required a bunch of different pieces, and there was one last component that was delayed because of shipping issues overseas. And the government would not pay until all of those things were delivered, even though they had received other big portions, right, of the order, and they had the rest and had confirmation, yada, yada. Well, they were holding millions of dollars just floating while waiting for this to be delivered. And then, oh, wait, there's the piece you talked about on the delay of payment. So I I then can't imagine in going direct that one of those companies would and their entire ecosystem would be okay with that type of delay or floating that type of money. So that's just something I've been thinking about with that recent example.
Okay. Well, let's tease that out a little bit more. Miriam, I wanted to ask you, how should agencies understand rebates, volume discounts, marketing funds, and other OEM incentives? Should those benefits flow directly to the government? And when do they appropriately compensate the reseller for building and supporting the market?
So that's a tough question because they're not predictable, they're not guaranteed, and there's a handful that offer them and then a lot that do not. And I'll put it all in their marketing development funds for the most part, especially in the public sector because of the rules we abide in. But hey, those funds are meant to be reinvested in the market to grow the business. So it's meant to help train and enable and educate the government customers, provide demo units and all that good stuff. But you can't count on having it. You don't know if you're going to get it. And most of the time it's not offered. So it's a one-off situation when it is, and usually proposal based and a lot of rules and guidelines around it. So it's hard to place a policy around that or give a straightforward answer in that bucket because you can't function as a business with the thought of getting any of those. It would be very risky to assume you are. And in a case where you do it, the intention is that you put it back towards the business and the OEMs really strictly audit and make sure that that's happening. So yeah, maybe something for this academic group to try to figure out, but we don't structure our business with the thought of getting those are a one-off situation and they all go back to supporting the customer that it's tied to in some way or another around enablement and growing that account to support that OEM.
Right. So again, it depends.
It depends, yeah. The theme of the day.
Yeah.
So, Lizzie, let me ask you. Critics argue that regulatory compliance is simply a contractor's cost of doing business. When does compliance support become a genuine service to the government rather than an overhead that should already be covered by ordinary profit.
I've heard that argument a lot. I think we touched on this, and it was actually also talked about in the previous panel, right? Contractors have to implement and have rigorous safeguards for things like sensitive information, complying with sourcing restrictions, right? You mentioned 889. It limits the use of lower cost components, suppliers. There's continuous monitoring of all of the regulatory requirements going on. I mean, think of how many lawyers have probably had to be hired from small businesses to make sure that they're complying with the deviations and then the agency's deviation to the deviation and then the proposed rule, even just thinking like RFO, right? Or GSA put out their new cyber framework. That's different than CMMC, a DOW. So all of those pieces, like it's the cost of doing business. It's a very expensive cost. So wouldn't you want, as the government, to incentivize companies to do so that they are complying to those requirements, right? Like, I think there's measurable value to the government by having companies that are investing in protecting that sensitive data and ensuring supply chain integrity. So, reducing the government's administrative burden like VARs do, I think I don't necessarily agree with that compliance isn't value.
Interesting, right? And of course, government always trying to streamline or at least be more cognizant of the cost of compliance, going all the way back to the
Well,
Section 809 panel. Roger?
well, yeah, compliance is a value. The government is saying it's a value. They're requiring you to do something, whether it's socioeconomic policy and small business subcontract plans, whether it's CMMC, whether it's a decision that, we're going to prohibit the purchase or even the use of Huawei equipment by government contractors. The government has placed a value on those things. And, and that's the reason why, as GSA noted in their summary of the RFI responses, it costs more to do work in the government because there are all these things that aren't necessarily applicable to a commercial transaction. TAA compliance, or made in America, in many instances, those things are going to cost more. But the government has made a value decision that we're going to, that's what we're going to require. So they've placed a value on it. They've said it's mandatory. You've got to do it. And companies should be able to, price accordingly because those are costs that have to be. Otherwise, it's what we're all talking about, reducing burdens. Well, you reduce burdens, you get more entrance to the market, you get better value, more competition, more actual performance of the work. And what's that right balance?
I've heard that and I believe it to be true, but I've not seen very many elements of codification or quantification of what those costs are. So for the whole panel, my question is, has anyone sat down and sharpened their pencil and defined those costs in a credible fashion?
I mean, how far back should we go? Like,
Yeah.
GAO
I mean, we just
maybe,
saw
or-
the CMMC program, right? Like how many partners invested in becoming CMMC, and then
Right.
just for the government to say, okay, it's paused, and okay, well, that's millions of dollars that small companies all made sure that they were. But so yeah, I mean, it would be worth the exercise, but like, how far back do you go on the different requirements? And as we advance very quickly, like you said, Rich, towards the AI and all this stuff, there's going to be more and more levels of compliancy that we all need to adapt to. And by the way, the VAR community has always met the government where they're at when it comes to that level, and investing ahead of it. So, yeah, it would be an interesting exercise to do. We should sit down.
I think there was a study done I'm talking
Right.
25 years ago or something that I can recall. But, the question is, why is it hard to do? Because I don't think it's layered into their operational costs. And it's not a separate line item that say, oh, maybe for some things it is like that. Miriam had a great example, CMMC. If you're paying 3 CPO or whatever to do the review of your operations, there's a number to that. But there's also not, but then you got people who are working with that company, to go over your systems, to scope what needs to be covered, things like that. So it's hard to quantify, I think, but it's real, and we all know it's real.
But isn't ORIA supposed to, the legislation called ORIA supposed to do or address those cost benefit concerns?
I I don't know whether it will or not.
Well, yeah.
Can I just say, Roger brought up a good point, which is around uh, trying to quantify that across multiple deals, right? So within this community, when GSA initially put out a letter to some VARs asking them to break down
Mhm.
every single cost, it had a lot of people scratching their heads saying, okay, well, I have a software engineer that's working on multiple things. So then do I take their salary, break it down? Do I ask them to do how many hours? I mean, talk about red tape right there. So that's probably where there's been some struggle, as bringing actually back to Roger's initial point of there's just this huge focus on costs that is misplaced. That's been one of the things where companies are saying, look, of course we're happy to be transparent and we're happy to do this, but it's not an XYZ exercise, right? There's complication across multiple deals and how this industry and this complex buying works, where it can't just be broken down in a simple spreadsheet.
Maybe it's an area for additional academic research.
So just on the cost issue question too, it's so true in the market that all these OEMs would be incurring costs directly on themselves to do all the things that value-added resellers and resellers do. And again, it goes back to the commercial shared services model that provides greater efficiency. And if you wanted to essentially eliminate that choice, I think you'd see, inflation in government contracting, as OEMs try to absorb and account for those costs and maintain margins, because they are in business. Everybody's in, business is there to make a profit, and margins have to be, reasonable. And to make those investments, I think actually the VARs and resellers are saving a lot of money for people at the end of the day on both sides of the transaction.
Well, does this argue for more transparency in pricing, perhaps as the cost of preserving the channel's role in federal procurement?
I don't know what that means, transparency in pricing. I mean, it goes back to Elizabeth mentioned, are breaking down, trying to figure out this, this software, engineer, how many hours is he working on the government contract? And if we're going to do that, then we're not going to get what we need at the speed of need, which is another big focus of this, rightly, of this administration, reducing time, in the market to get what capability across government, but especially at the Department of War. And if you're going to break it down for all this transparency, that's where also competition at the end of the day.
Yeah.
That's the role of competition, to validate this approaches and the pricing.
So GSA's response to the RFI on this point is still a bit murky to you, Roger.
I wrote a blog about it. It makes me nervous.
Well, I'm interested in what those solicitation enhancements are going to look like, right?
Right.
Is it trying to do what we're all questioning how you could possibly do and break it down? I know that's been a lot of heartburn of industry.
Yeah, and I would say and GSA is good about this, is I expect them to be transparent and not throw something out there saying, here, do this, but to the extent they decide to do something, they'll move forward in a collaborative manner and share it with industry, try to get feedback. That's my expectation. And give people an opportunity to say, hey, the unintended consequence of this, or, this makes sense, or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, here's a question for the whole panel. What is one reseller function the government should realistically perform itself, and one function that would become more costly or less effective if shifted back to the government?
Just one.
Jeopardy.
I mean, I guess mine would be the risk of doing business with the government. Those fun clauses about termination of convenience and, um, you know, all the T's and C's that we have to agree to and the payments and that financial risk. I think that's a big bag that the channel carries on the behalf of the OEMs and the government. And I'm not sure the OEMs would take that on.
Roger, is there something that government should take back unto itself?
I'm going to answer it this way. I'm going to say the government, I think it was, I think in the last panel, but there's a discussion of understanding the value that the VAR or a proposed solution that's being brought. The government should have some organic capability when they're working with a VAR who's designing or coming up with a configuration to say, yeah, that makes sense. That one makes sense for what we're doing. And I think that's an area where the government needs more resources to be able to, work with VARs or any contractor, like, we've designed this. What do you think? Does it make sense? Where are we going? What do we need to adjust? That's that technical capability. And that's something that historically you go back, so I get my age, Rich, our age, Rich. It's like in the 1990s, there used to be a lot more folks around who were, experts in certain things, or that was their job. I think nowadays, we rely on the private sector and government hires folks to help them do those kind of things. But I think that's an area.
Well, in the last couple of minutes that we have here, I'm still not satisfied. We've heard enough from Lizzie about small and mid-tier innovation. So I'm going to ask Lizzie to bring us home. And the question is, how can acquisition policy preserve small and mid-sized participation while also advancing strategic sourcing, category management, and enterprise-wide purchasing?
Phew, I'm glad I didn't have to answer that last question there. Saved by the bell. So how can it be promoted? I think the recognition, especially in this space, that VARs are prime contractors, that small businesses are sophisticated businesses is very important. There is a view at many agencies that a small business is like two people in their garage, and not a knock to Michael Dell of how he started his business, but like that's how they're operating, right? When really they are sophisticated, innovative, agile companies, and that they already partner with companies like Carasoft and other larges to be subcontractors in different ways, but that shouldn't be their main role. And you mentioned category management. We have spent since 2018 talking about how bad category management is for smalls and the problems with category management. And I will say OneGov is category management on steroids, which that's a direct quote from Larry Hale, so that I didn't come up with that one. But I think that kind of shows the need for, to your previous question, government to own the responsibility of promoting competition, caring about meeting the small business goals. I get asked all the time, why aren't those goals mandated? They should be. They never will be. That will never happen. So the onus really is on the government to seek out those small and mid-sized companies that are providing that innovation or going through their larger partners to find those as well, instead of just clicking the easy button of saying, hey, we're going to do a multi-billion-dollar sole source contract with this big company because it's easy. That's cutting out a lot of innovation, and it's really contradictory to the main stated goals of competition that this administration is trying to move forward in this acquisition environment. So looking at those companies holistically and how they interact with other larger folks is an important part of this acquisition system, and it shouldn't be discounted.
That's a wonderful ribbon to tie around this. As we close our roundtable, I want to thank all of you for joining us on this important discussion about the emerging role of value-added resellers and resellers in the federal IT marketplace. To briefly recap, several important themes have emerged from our discussion this afternoon. First, the debate over VARs and resellers should not be reduced to a simple choice between buying directly from the OEM and buying through an intermediary. The real question is, what arrangement delivers the best value for the government in a particular acquisition? In some cases, direct purchasing may produce greater transparency, lower costs, and clearer relationships with the technology provider. But in many other cases, a VAR or reseller may deliver significant value by integrating products, managing licenses, supporting multiple vendors, and meeting security and compliance requirements. Second, we need to distinguish genuine value-added services from transactions in which a reseller performs little more than a pass-through function. The government has every right to ask what it is paying for, how fees and markups are calculated, and whether the reseller is assuming meaningful responsibilities and risks. Greater transparency should be viewed not as an attack on the reseller community, but as a way to identify and preserve the parts of the channel that provide real value. And finally, and as was discussed at length, competition must remain at the center of this conversation. The government should be careful that its pursuit of lower prices does not unintentionally concentrate the market among a few large manufacturers or a handful of dominant resellers. Small and mid-sized VARs often introduce new technologies, assist emerging companies in entering the federal market, and provide specialized expertise. Acquisition reform should open the marketplace, not narrow it. Thanks again to our panelists for identifying these issues. Each of you has brought a different and valuable perspective, both from government and industry. Your insights into acquisition policy, technology companies, and the emerging landscape is enormously appreciated. And we look forward to continue our work at the Baroni Center to bring government, industry, and policy leaders together to examine difficult acquisition issues and develop practical balanced reforms. Over to you, Mike, for final comments.
Thanks, Rich. I just want to echo your thanks to our speakers today. Also, thank you to our attendees. This was a long session, but I think that if you stayed on for the entire event, you gained so much useful information. And Rich, thank you for moderating this. I'm gonna start calling you the Marathon Man. That's my new nickname for you. This was really great content and highly relevant in terms of the timing, as both federal buyers and sellers of technology are thinking about how to maximize value from intermediary relationships. We heard some myths get debunked. We also gained some really great perspective about, I think, what it's going to take for government agencies to shift to a model that balances and recognizes both short-term transactional value with longer-term and more holistic value. So I'm hoping that today's conversation is just a starting point for a longer-term dialogue around what I think is a very important topic for both government and industry. I'd like to invite our audience to peruse the paper that served as the catalyst for today's workshop. You can find that paper by Rich at the Baroni Center website. And do please consider registering for some of our upcoming programming. On September 16th, we'll be holding our annual Small Business Summit with CCAF. The theme this year is Navigating Small Business GovCon Realities. What is my North Star? This is an in-person event that's going to be held here at our Arlington campus of George Mason University. And the third installment of our webinar series on the RFO is going to be held on October 20th. We'll be addressing major RFO impacts to the workforce with perspectives from people that are on the front lines, both on the government and industry side of the acquisition workforce. We hope to see you for those and future events as the Greg and Camille Baroni Center for Government Contracting continues shaping the business of government where policy meets practice. Take care.